left the presence of God.
Thanks, Rick. Here we are. All right, today we are beginning a new series that I'm really excited about. It's called Through the Valley, What the Bible Says About When Life Hurts. We all encounter deep and tragic pain at one time or another, and you don't have to go looking for trouble, is the thing. Trouble is more than capable of coming to find you no matter where you are. So over the next few weeks, we'll be reading 4 different sections of the Bible to discover what insights they have for us as we try to live lives of faith in the midst of hardships. Next week, we are going to be talking about Habakkuk. Yeah, that's a real thing. That's a book in the Bible. All right, it's in the Old Testament toward the end. It's only 3 chapters long. So if afterwards, after you hear what I have to say, and you can share with me what you have to say. So just a thought. It'll take you about 15 minutes to read it. So if you can set aside 15 minutes to read Habakkuk this week, we can have a great conversation at the close of service after you hear what I have to say. Today, a word of warning, today is going to be more teachy than I usually am. Because I want to get through the whole idea of Job, and then I'm going to just throw some little lessons at you at the end. So usually I'm trying to tie in some stories, some examples, some illustrations. I ain't got time for that today. Usually I'll write through all the things, all the important facts about the Bible stuff I'm working on, and then I go back and do that. But I was already as long as I could go with just the story itself. So buckle up. Get out your pen if you want to take some notes. Today would be a good day for that as we work through Job, because Job is a weird book. I think it's probably one of the best known yet least understood books in the Bible. See, on the one hand, there's the very simple story, and on the other hand, it's this great poetic deep dive into the mystery of faith. And here's what I mean. So the story's familiar enough, right? God and Satan are hanging out, and God says, "Hey Satan, have you noticed how righteous Job is?" And Satan replies, "Well, you know, he's only righteous because you keep blessing him. If you let me mess with his stuff, he'll turn on you in a heartbeat." And God says, "Let her rip. Bring it on. Just don't hurt Job, okay?" And so Satan goes down to earth, and through a series of calamities, Satan wipes out Job's oxen and sheep and camels and children. And Job is noticeably upset by all this, as one would be. And Job 1 says that Job got to his feet, ripped his robe, shaved his head, then fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I'll return to the womb of the earth. God gives, God takes. God's name be ever blessed." And through all this tragedy, Job doesn't sin. He never turns his back on God. So, of course, Satan goes back up to God. There must be like some sort of express elevator that goes straight up to heaven. And Satan goes back and says, "Okay, he's still not turning his back on you, but please, can I hurt him?" And of course, God says, "Okay, do whatever you want, but just don't kill him, okay?" And so Job gets nasty sores all over his body. And Job goes out to the town trash heap and finds a piece of broken pottery and just sits there scratching the scabs and pus on his body. All right, now that you've got that image, let's go have brunch, right? Anyway, after that, some friends come up to Job and give him some advice that doesn't make sense. And then God shows up and says some mysterious stuff. And then finally, in the end, God restores Job's fortune and even doubles it. The end. That's the story of Job. Does that sound about right? Does that sound familiar? Like that's about the rhythm of how it goes? Does it feel like something's missing in that review of Job, in that summary? Well, here's some details that I think you might find helpful as we think through the book of Job. Most of the story that I've told you happens in chapters 1 and 2 and 42. And the other 39 chapters are a bunch of poetry. recounting the counsel of Job's friends and Job's reactions and Job's conversations with God. So let me say that again. Most of Job is this poetic reflection on the interaction between Job and his friends. But we all just know the story part. Does that seem off balance to you? Like maybe we should figure out what that middle, that modest little, most of the book middle chunk is. Also, God gets the last word in all of this stuff too. So, what exactly is going on here? Why do we recall the story but forget about the vast majority of it? Why do we hear about Job's tragedy and then skip straight to the end when he gets everything back? Why is Job so tricky? And well, one reason might be because we are probably dealing with more than one author here. From what scholars can tell, the easy part of Job, chapters 1, 2, 42, can be traced back to very ancient sources. It's a folk story that was probably common throughout the ancient world across different religions in the world where this book came from. It's an ancient Near Eastern fable like Hansel and Gretel or the Three Billy Goats Gruff. The original narrative parts of Job were actually inherited by the Jewish tradition. And then the rest, that middle chunk that comprises most of the book, that's commentary on the story they already knew. Chapters 1, 2, and 42 are a story created by people who did not necessarily have our same understanding of God. And all that stuff in the middle is an attempt to understand it and talk about it. So, for starters, let me just say that this is really helpful in thinking through this capricious, kind of a jerk God that we meet in chapters 1 and 2, right? Have you ever thought of that about God in Job? Like, why would he just let Satan do whatever he wants? Well, it's because, when we flip through our Bibles, this idea of God just doesn't really fit. A God who would put a guy through hell just to prove a point, right? That doesn't sound loving or graceful or appealing at all. But if we think of the God we find in chapters 1 and 2 of Job as someone else, not the God of love and compassion that we meet elsewhere in the Bible, but this idea of God imported from another time and another place, and that it's just given to us as an idea to contemplate, well, that's really helpful. Now we don't have this mashed-up idea of God that doesn't fit with the God we encounter in the rest of the Bible. The bulk of the book, most of the chapters, 3 through 41, are actually a poetic commentary on that story that would have already been familiar to the first readers of Job. The original audience would have known the story part already. And the author of the middle part of Job took that well-known story and used it as a starting point for a rich and meaningful exploration of how we can relate to God, even when life is hard. So I can imagine that some of us here heard the story of Job, and then when we encounter our own Job chapters of life, things are not going as planned, we're hurting deep inside and outside, we turn to the book of Job to find someone who could identify with our suffering. Have you done that in your own life? We look to Job for an answer to the question, why do good people suffer? And that's the traditional question that people bring to the book of Job. Why do the righteous suffer? People suppose that since we get to see behind the curtain of heaven, that we actually see the decision process through which God lets Satan wreak all kinds of havoc on Job's life, that this book must have some kind of answer when we're wondering why, right? When we're wondering why God would let this pain happen to us. And that is what we deeply wish the book of Job had for us. And that's how we wish it worked. But guess what? We don't get to decide how the book works. We don't get to decide what question it's out to answer. Instead, we have to sit back, take in the text, and read it on its own terms. And like I said, most of Job is a response and a commentary to this story itself that bookends the commentary, the poetry, inserted into a tradition like a fable from a previous generation. And so even though people turn to Job for the reason behind our suffering, this really isn't the best place to find that answer. Instead, here's what we get, all right? We get Job's friends who represent a popular view of Job's day, the conventional wisdom. And that is to do good and God will reward you. Do bad and God will punish you. And this is actually pretty conventional wisdom even today in our world. And that's why these friends of Job insist that Job must have done something wrong as he faces tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. They believe in a universe that works predictably, formulaically. They believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. If Job and his friends were having this conversation today, they would have turned to Job and almost certainly told him the 5 worst words you can say to a suffering person. Do you know what the 5 worst words you can say to a suffering person are? Everything happens for a reason. We want so badly for our pain to have meaning. But in the midst of our hardships, it's really important that we just grieve, that we just allow ourselves to feel bad. Yes, good might come out of these struggles someday. But when the pain is still really, really close, still heavy on our hearts, we need to leave those questions about meaning for another time. We typically insist that everything happens for a reason to make it easier on us, the friends who are trying to lend comfort to someone who's in pain. Because if everything happens for a reason, we don't have to carry them. Because they don't need to be carried because there's some big plan that's being orchestrated right now. Job's friends insist that everything happens for a reason. And I guess if you're reading the story of Job, they're not wrong. They assumed that the cause was Job's sin, but we know the truth. As readers, we know in Job, the cause of Job's troubles was that God had hung Job out to dry. So everything happens for a reason. God is being kind of a jerk. That's the reason in Job. I don't believe that's the reason behind the world that we live in when hard things happen today. And we're going to continue to explore that question of why do bad things happen and does everything happen for a reason in the coming weeks. So I encourage you to keep coming back during this series. But Job is experiencing a God who is kind of a jerk. That's how he feels too. That's how we all feel sometimes. Let's be honest, right? We feel like there should be more justice, more help from on high. And after hearing out his friends, Job is at his wits' end. Here's Job's final, exasperated defense of his own character. It goes like this. What did I do to deserve this? Did I ever hit anyone who was calling for help? Haven't I wept for those who live a hard life? Been heartsick over the lot of the poor, but where did it get me? I expected good, but evil showed up. I looked for light, but darkness fell. My stomach's in a constant churning, never settles down. Each day confronts me with more suffering. I walk under a black cloud. The sun is gone. I stand in the congregation and protest. Job has a question. He asks, what did I do to deserve this? He shouts it at the heavens, demanding an answer from God. And based on the wisdom of his friends and conventional wisdom of the age, there should be an answer to his question. But just because that's Job's question, just because that's our question, doesn't mean it's the question that the book of Job is here to answer for us. we'll probably get a lot closer to the heart of the book when we hear what the voice of God has to say in reply to Job. Job says, "Where are you, God?" And remarkably, God shows up and says, "Here I am." God rolls for a few chapters speaking to Job out of a whirlwind. And here's just a taste of God's response. God says, "And have you ever ordered morning? Get up. Have you ever told dawn, go to work, so you could seize earth like a blanket and shake out the wicked like cockroaches? As the sun brings everything to light, brings out all the colors and shapes, the cover of darkness is snatched from the wicked. They're caught in the very act. Have you ever gotten to the true bottom of things, explored the labyrinthine caves of deep ocean? Do you know the first thing about death? Do you have one clue regarding death's dark mysteries? And do you have any idea how large the earth is? Speak up if you have even the beginning of an answer." That's what God has to say back to Job. Not very direct as answers go, but very direct in terms of God's speech to Job. So apparently God has little interest in answering Job's question about why. Instead, God questions Job's right to ask a question like that at all. God lays it out for Job. Your human mind can't fathom this vast world that I created and that I command. And so, if we think about this, the logical step from here is to realize that if God's capacity for understanding is that much greater than our own, we probably can't really grasp the reasons behind our suffering. And God goes on, asking question after question. God says, "Are you strong like me? Do you know about ancient creatures of the deep? What do you have to say for yourself?" And Job is left speechless. He responds to God the only way he can, with humility, admitting that he had no business asking these questions because the answers would be too much for him anyway. And that is when Job gets restored. When he stops fighting with his friends and grasping at a big reason why behind his pain, that's when God blesses Job with double the wealth he had before. That's the story behind the story in Job. And I'm going to share just a few of the lessons that I've pulled out of Job. There are so many more. This is just 3 thoughts that I want to share with you today as you go and read this for yourself later on. So, the first thing I want to share with you that I learned from Job in my work this week through this book is that easy answers will always fail you. Easy answers will always fail you. And by easy answers, I don't mean first grade math homework. By easy answers, I mean that in the complexity of this life, we are faced with a remarkable variety of challenges. Intellectual challenges, moral challenges, spiritual, relational challenges, every kind and they all weave together to make this life, this messy, complicated life. And there are systems that want to tell us that somehow, if you do just this one thing, somehow all of this complexity will become simple for you. Just pray more. Just do yoga. Just go to the right church. Just send money to this TV preacher and you'll get blessed. You can think of another system in your head, I'm sure. Go to the right school, right? Or eat the right food and not the wrong food. Or all these relatively easy fixes, and if you just do that, your world will become simple. But in my experience and in my reading of Job, life is never just anything. Answers are rarely easy. The right choice is rarely obvious. And if you are suffering, you are not suffering today just because you sinned. Though that might be part of it, I don't know. You aren't a mess just because of your parents. But that's probably part of it. There are some baseline standards of justice and truth. But we also live in a real world where things rarely, if ever, work out the way they do in fables, like Hansel and Gretel, or the Three Little Pigs, or Job. So, that's number one. Easy answers will always fail you. Another lesson from the book of Job is this: the best response to pain is faith. Let me explain that a little bit. I know there are a lot of people that point to the existence of pain and suffering in the world as a reason to give up on God, or religion, or spirituality of any kind entirely. And if that's you or someone you know, I'd love to have a conversation about that with you. Because the reality is that it's the existence of pain and loss that has led humanity through our search for spiritual truth throughout history. Like, it's because of that pain that we are so concerned about it. It's not a reason to reject God, it's a reason to gravitate to God. For most people. We don't wonder, what is God like, because everything is going so great, right? We wonder what God is like so we can understand who it is that we are leaning on through hardships, through personal tragedy, so we can understand what might await us on the other side of this life, so we can understand what the good life looks like, because we know there's something better. The best response to suffering is faith, because it's in faith that we lean into the pain and the mystery. Asking, "Where are you, God?" That's an act of faith. Screaming at God, "Why did you do this to me?" That's an act of faith. When life gets hard, it isn't time to cocoon yourself away and shield yourself from the rest of the world. It's time to lean into your faith and into a community of faith. We are here for you. This is the place where you can let your scars show, and where you can know your shame and pain will be met with grace. The whole point. So, easy answers will always fail you. The best response to pain is faith. And the third and final thing I want to share with you from Job today is this: the answer is a person, not an idea. We've talked a lot about this question: how can God allow suffering? And we'll talk about it more in the coming weeks. And finding that idea, that kernel of truth behind it all, has been really elusive, right? But in all the thinking and reading I've done on this subject over the years, there's one truth I've settled on that I just can't shake. Your beliefs about pain don't matter if you don't know the one who holds our world together. It doesn't matter what you think is going on behind the scenes if you aren't seeking the one who is there already. We want to believe that if we get the answer to our question, we can live with whatever happens. But that isn't true. You can know the reason why your car won't start, but unless you have someone who can fix it, you're still stranded. When we hurt, we want hope and peace. In Christ, we encounter hope and peace with a name, with hands that healed the hurting, with eyes that looked on the lost with compassion. Throughout this tragic story of Job, Job never stopped believing, never stopped acting in faith. Instead, he cried out to the one who tells the sun where to stand in the sky. And the wealth he gained there far outweighed his earthly riches. May we hear these lessons from the story of Job and live them out as we face pain and sadness with faith and hope. Pray with me. God, we come up woefully short when we search for answers. You are mystery, but you are also love and compassion and joy and generosity in 1,000 ways. And so we ask that you would help us to find you where you are, not where we want you to be. We ask that you would free us to come to you with all of the sadness, all of the anger, all of the frustration and doubt, and to lay it before you as an act of solemn, sacred, beautiful faith. And to lean on the people around us, the community of faith, the people that you have commissioned to stand together in your name, to act as you would act with peace, compassion, healing, and truth. May we be those people in deeper, truer ways because of our time together this morning.